The air in the parking lot was thick with tension as the officer's boots crunched against the asphalt. His sharp voice cut through the quiet, commanding attention. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The man, standing near his car, barely flinched at the tone. He simply turned, his posture calm but firm, the tailored fit of his suit standing out in the ordinary suburban sprawl. His silence only seemed to ignite the officer further. "You hear me? I asked you a question," the officer barked, his hand instinctively resting on his belt as if the man before him posed a threat. "This is a private lot. You can't just loiter around here." The man glanced at the officer, his expression measured, but his voice carried the weight of 1,000 battles fought. "I'm not loitering. I parked here, same as anyone else. Is there a problem?" The officer's face hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Yeah, there's a problem. People like you think they can waltz into neighborhoods like this and act like you own the place." He took a step closer, invading the man's space. "Show me some ID. Prove you even have a right to be here." For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that makes your chest tighten, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The man's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his composure didn't falter. He reached into his pocket and handed over his ID without a word, his gaze steady as it met the officer's. But the officer barely glanced at it before tossing it back with a sneer. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. "Doesn't look like you belong here anyway." The man tilted his head slightly, his voice cutting through the officer's thin veneer of authority. "And what exactly does someone who belongs here look like?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, his face twisted into a smirk as he reached out, grabbing the man's arm. The grip was tight, aggressive, designed to demean. The man tried to pull his arm free, but the officer's hand only tightened, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You know what I mean. Don't get smart with me." The man's voice sharpened, cutting through the night like a blade. "Take your hand off me." "What are you gonna do about it?" the officer challenged, his smirk widening into a grin that was equal parts mockery and threat. Without waiting for an answer, his other hand shot forward, delivering a blow to the man's chest with the force of someone who believed they were untouchable. The crack of the impact echoed in the quiet lot, but what happened next left the officer frozen. The man didn't stumble. He didn't fall. He straightened his tie, his breath steady, and met the officer's shocked gaze with one of steel. And then, in one swift motion, he struck back. Not out of anger, but with the precision and control of someone who had spent years mastering the art of restraint. The officer reeled, staggering back as his hand shot to his face, the disbelief plain on his features. "What the hell?" the officer started, his voice cracking as he stared at the man before him. But the man didn't answer. He stood tall, his presence suddenly commanding the space in a way that made the officer's authority seem laughable. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" the man finally said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet fury that sent a chill through the air. The officer blinked, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "You think you can just assault a cop and walk away? You're done. Finished." You'll what?" the man interrupted, his voice now a low, dangerous rumble. "You'll call for backup? File a report? Go ahead. Make that call. But when you do, be ready to explain why you assaulted the new chief of police." The officer's mouth opened, then closed, his face draining of color as the words sank in. Chief of police. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt off its axis. He stumbled back, his hand still clutching his face, his confidence crumbling with every passing second. But the man didn't stop there. He took a step closer, his voice calm but cutting as he spoke. "You think that badge makes you untouchable? You think you can get away with treating people like this just because you wear a uniform? Let me tell you something. That badge doesn't protect you from accountability. And tonight, you're going to learn exactly what that means." The officer's radio crackled to life at his hip, but he didn't move to answer it. His hands trembled as he stared at the man before him, his mind racing with the weight of what he had just done. And as the reality of the situation began to set in, one question loomed above all else. What happens to a man who believes he's above the law when he finally comes face to face with justice? Stay tuned. This is only the beginning. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and any form of discrimination. To every black viewer watching this video, know that you are seen, valued, and supported. Your voice matters, your experiences matter, and we are here to share stories that reflect the fight for justice and equality. Today's story is one of courage, resilience, and the undeniable power of standing up against injustice. Stay with us for this impactful journey, and if you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Let's keep growing together. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The city of Brixton had always been a place of contrasts. On one side, a thriving downtown district with skyscrapers that shimmered in the sunlight, cafes where professionals gathered to sip overpriced coffee, and neighborhoods where pristine lawns framed picturesque homes. On the other side, there were areas marked by cracked sidewalks, overgrown lots, and a deep sense of history that its residents carried like armor. For many, it was a city defined by who you were, where you came from, and the invisible boundaries that told you where you didn't belong. At the center of this story was Marcus Hayes, a man who had spent his life navigating those boundaries. Born and raised in Brixton's Elmwood neighborhood, Marcus was no stranger to the systemic challenges that came with being black in America, let alone in a city with a long and complicated history like Brixton's. Elmwood was the kind of place that bred resilience. Its streets were alive with the sounds of children playing, music spilling from open windows, and the chatter of neighbors who looked out for one another. Marcus had grown up amidst it all, learning early on the value of hard work, community, and standing tall in the face of adversity. His father had been a firefighter, a local hero who was as much a part of the neighborhood as the corner store or the church on Maple Street. His mother, a schoolteacher, had instilled in Marcus a deep respect for education and the power of knowledge. From them, Marcus learned the importance of service, integrity, and never letting anyone make you feel less than you were. These lessons carried him through his teenage years, through the challenges of college, and eventually into the police academy. For Marcus, becoming a police officer had been about more than a paycheck or a uniform. It was about being a force for good in a system that too often failed the very people it was meant to serve. He wanted to be the kind of officer his community could trust, someone who understood their struggles because he had lived them. And for years, he was just that. Rising through the ranks, Marcus earned a reputation for fairness, professionalism, and a quiet determination that set him apart. By the time he was named the city's first black chief of police, he had become a symbol of hope for Elmwood and a beacon of change for the entire city. But not everyone in Brixton was ready for change. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Officer Darren Collins, a man whose presence on the force was as divisive as it was entrenched. Darren came from a family with deep ties to Brixton's police department, his father and grandfather both having served before him. To Darren, the badge was a symbol of authority, a license to command respect, and an extension of the power he had always craved. Unlike Marcus, Darren had never seen the uniform as a tool for service. For him, it was a weapon, something to wield against those he deemed unworthy, those who didn't fit into his narrow vision of what Brixton should be. Darren's record was peppered with complaints, allegations of excessive force, racially charged remarks, and a trail of incidents that had raised eyebrows but never consequences. The system protected its own, and Darren had always counted on that. His colleagues either feared him, admired his bravado, or simply looked the other way. Over time, Darren's confidence in his untouchability grew, bolstered by the unspoken culture within the department that allowed men like him to thrive. The day Darren and Marcus crossed paths began like any other. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air carried the faint smell of leaves and the city seemed almost peaceful. Marcus had decided to visit one of Brixton's precincts unannounced, a habit he had developed early in his tenure as chief. He believed in being present, in seeing the day-to-day realities of his officers and the communities they served. Dressed in a sharp suit and without his usual entourage, Marcus parked his car in a public lot near the precinct and took a moment to survey his surroundings. It was then that Darren saw him. To Darren, Marcus was just another black man in a suit who looked out of place in a neighborhood like this. He didn't recognize the chief, why would he? Darren wasn't the type to pay attention to department announcements or city press conferences. He had no interest in politics or progress. What Darren saw was an opportunity. A chance to assert his dominance, to flex his authority, and to remind someone that they didn't belong. The interaction that followed was as swift as it was degrading. Darren approached Marcus with the air of someone who had done this 100 times before. His voice carried that particular edge, the one that hinted at power without justification, that dared someone to challenge him. Marcus, calm and measured as always, responded with patience, trying to de-escalate the situation without revealing who he was. But Darren wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for submission. When Marcus handed over his ID, Darren barely glanced at it. His contempt was palpable, a mix of arrogance and ignorance that only fueled the humiliation he sought to inflict. It wasn't enough to question Marcus's presence. Darren needed to assert himself physically, to turn the interaction into a spectacle of power. And so, without warning, he struck. What Darren hadn't counted on was Marcus's composure. Years of training, experience, and a deep-seated understanding of moments like this had prepared Marcus for what came next. He didn't retaliate in anger, but with a controlled response that left Darren stunned. In that moment, the dynamics shifted. The man Darren had sought to humiliate stood tall, his presence filling the space in a way that left no room for doubt. As Marcus calmly revealed his identity, Darren's world began to unravel. The man he had just assaulted wasn't some nameless figure he could intimidate into silence. He was the chief of police, a man with the power to dismantle everything Darren had built his career on. And as the weight of that realization settled over Darren, the question hung in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The stage was set, the lines drawn, and the story that followed would not only test the limits of justice but reveal the true character of everyone involved. The precinct buzzed with the usual hum of activity, phones ringing, officers shuffling papers, muted conversations about cases both mundane and serious. The atmosphere was familiar to Marcus Hayes, almost comforting in its routine chaos. But today, as he walked into the building with the weight of the morning's incident still fresh, the air felt different. Subtle glances followed him, whispers exchanged in corners. It didn't take long for word to travel, even without Marcus saying a word about what had transpired in the parking lot. He kept his composure as he moved through the halls, his sharp gaze landing on everyone he passed. He could feel the tension, the curiosity buzzing just beneath the surface. A few officers nodded respectfully, others avoided eye contact altogether. Marcus wasn't one to command attention with his presence alone, but today there was a gravity to him that couldn't be ignored. In his office, Marcus sat in silence for a moment, staring out the window at the city he had sworn to protect. The events of the morning replayed in his mind, the sneer on Darren's face, the arrogance in his voice, the weight of his fist. Marcus had dealt with men like Darren before, but never this close, never with such blatant disregard for who he was or what he represented. The sting of humiliation burned, not for himself, but for what it symbolized. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a system that had allowed someone like Darren to thrive. The knock at the door broke his thoughts. Detective Laura Rivera stepped in, her expression a mix of professionalism and concern. Laura had been one of Marcus's earliest allies when he took over as chief, a sharp, dedicated officer who believed in the same ideals he did. She closed the door softly behind her, her voice low. "I heard something happened this morning," she said, her eyes searching his face. "People are talking, but no one knows the full story. Are you okay?" Marcus let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. I'm fine, Laura. But we've got a bigger problem. Her brow furrowed, and she took a seat across from him, her body language shifting to full attention. What kind of problem? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a file on his desk, sliding it toward her. Inside were complaints, reports, and statements, years of accumulated warnings about Darren Collins. Laura flipped through the pages, her expression darkening with each new piece of evidence. This guy, she started, shaking her head. How has he managed to stay on the force? Marcus's voice was steady but carried an edge. You know how. He's protected by the system, by the same culture we've been trying to change. This morning, he tried to throw his weight around on the wrong person. And now, we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with it again. Laura nodded, her jaw tightening. What's the plan? Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. I need every complaint, every incident he's been involved in. I want a full picture, dates, witnesses, anything we can use to hold him accountable. And I need it fast. Darren doesn't know who I am yet, but when he finds out, he'll try to cover his tracks. We can't let that happen. Laura's eyes met his, a spark of determination lighting in her gaze. I'll start pulling files right away. But Marcus, if you're going after him, you need to be prepared for pushback. Darren has friends, and they won't let this go without a fight. I'm counting on it, Marcus replied, his tone unyielding. Meanwhile, in the precinct's break room, Darren was the center of attention, recounting his version of the morning's events to a small group of officers. His voice was loud, brash, dripping with the same arrogance that had fueled his actions. Guy thought he could talk down to me, Darren said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. I showed him who's in charge. Bet he won't be sticking around this neighborhood anymore. One of the younger officers, visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Do you know who he was? I mean, what if he wasn't just some random guy? Darren waved him off. Doesn't matter. A guy like that doesn't belong around here. Trust me, I did the city a favor. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Even those who typically sided with Darren seemed uneasy, their glances shifting toward one another. The weight of his words lingered, a quiet reminder of the divide that ran through the department. Back in his office, Marcus reviewed the initial files Laura had brought him, each one painting a clearer picture of Darren's unchecked behavior. Excessive force during traffic stops. Unnecessary arrests. Complaints of racial profiling that had been dismissed or quietly buried. Marcus's grip tightened on the pages as he read, the words fueling his resolve. But it wasn't just about Darren. This was about the department, about the culture that had allowed men like him to operate without consequence. Marcus knew that taking Darren down wouldn't be enough. If they were going to make real change, it had to go deeper. By the end of the day, the tension in the precinct had grown thicker, the undercurrent of uncertainty spreading like wildfire. Whispers of Marcus's presence reached Darren, though no one dared to approach him directly. He caught fragments of conversations, snippets of speculation that gnawed at the edges of his confidence. Chief's looking into something, he's not happy about what happened this morning, Collins might be in trouble. The unease grew, but Darren pushed it aside, his bravado a shield against the creeping doubt. He didn't know who the man in the parking lot was, but as long as no one came forward, he believed he could spin the narrative in his favor. What he didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just coming for him. He was building a case that would shake the department to its core, one that would expose not only Darren but everyone who had enabled his behavior. And as the day drew to a close, with the precinct settling into its usual rhythm, the stage was quietly being set for a reckoning. Marcus's plans were already in motion, and Darren was running out of time. The question now wasn't whether justice would be served. It was how far Marcus was willing to go to ensure it. And as the pieces fell into place, one thing became clear: the fallout would be unlike anything the department had ever seen. The precinct was unusually quiet for the late hour, the fluorescent lights casting an artificial glow on the rows of desks and filing cabinets. Marcus Hayes stood in the observation room, his gaze fixed on the two-way mirror that reflected the interrogation room on the other side. Darren Collins sat there, his arms crossed and his face set in a mask of forced indifference, though the tightness around his jaw betrayed his discomfort. Marcus's expression was unreadable, but his silence carried the weight of the moment. Laura Rivera stood beside him, a file in her hand, her own face a mixture of determination and unease. She glanced at Marcus, her voice low as she broke the silence. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained on Darren, watching the man who had ignited this confrontation with his arrogance and ignorance. Finally, Marcus nodded, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not about me being ready. It's about making sure he knows exactly what he's done and what's coming." Laura hesitated before speaking again. "He's not going to go down without a fight. You know that." Marcus gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm counting on it." Inside the interrogation room, Darren shifted in his seat, his patience visibly thinning. He glanced at the mirrored wall, his disdain evident as he muttered under his breath. When the door finally opened, his eyes snapped to it, narrowing as Marcus stepped inside. Marcus closed the door behind him, the click echoing in the still room. "You've got some nerve, don't you?" Darren started, his tone dripping with defiance. "Pulling me in here like I'm some kind of criminal. You think you can intimidate me?" Marcus didn't sit. He remained standing, his presence filling the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. "Officer Collins," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about intimidation. This is about accountability." Darren let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Incredulously. "Accountability? For what?" "Doing my job." "You're wasting your time, Chief." "I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unflinching. "You didn't do anything wrong. Let's talk about that. Let's start with the parking lot this morning. You saw me, assumed I didn't belong, and decided to make it your mission to remind me of my place. Is that about right?" Darren's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered, his tone defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was doing my duty." "You looked suspicious." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a lower, sharper tone. "I looked suspicious. Is that what you tell yourself to justify what you did? Grabbing me. Hitting me. Humiliating me because you thought you could get away with it. Because you thought I was just another black man you could push around." Darren's bravado began to crack under the weight of Marcus's words, but he held on to his defiance. "I didn't know who you were. If I'd known, that's the problem, isn't it?" Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Darren's excuses like a blade. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Chief of police or not, you had no right to treat me, or anyone, like that. But you did, because you've been allowed to for years." Darren's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain control of the conversation. "You think you're better than me? Walking in here like you're some kind of savior, trying to tear me down. You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with people who don't respect us, who don't respect the badge." Marcus straightened, his gaze never wavering. "Don't you dare talk to me about respect. Respect is earned, not demanded at the end of a fist or a gun. And the badge you're so quick to hide behind? It's not a shield for your ego or your prejudice. It's a symbol of service, of justice. Two things you've clearly forgotten." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension palpable as Marcus's words hung in the air. Darren's composure was slipping, his bluster giving way to a simmering frustration he could no longer mask. "So what now, huh? You think you're going to ruin me? Destroy my career? Go ahead. See if I care." Marcus's voice was cold, each word measured and deliberate. This isn't about ruining you, Darren. This is about holding you accountable. You've left a trail of damage, complaints, and ruined lives in your wake. And it ends here. Darren leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't scare me, Hayes. I've seen guys like you come and go. You think you're making a difference, but you're just another cog in the machine. You'll burn out, just like the rest of them. Marcus's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes as he replied. Maybe I will. But not before I make sure men like you are held accountable. Not before I make it clear to this department, to this city, that there's no place for what you represent. The door opened again, and Laura stepped inside, a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on the table in front of Darren, her gaze steady as she spoke. This is everything we've got on you. Every complaint, every incident, every time you abused your authority and thought no one would notice. It's all here. Darren stared at the folder, his confidence faltering as he realized the depth of what he was up against. Marcus stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. You can either take responsibility for your actions, or you can keep pretending you're untouchable. Either way, the truth is coming out. The choice is yours. Darren's silence was deafening, his bravado stripped away as the weight of the evidence pressed down on him. For the first time, he looked uncertain, his gaze darting between Marcus and Laura as he tried to calculate his next move. Marcus didn't wait for an answer. He turned to leave, his final words hanging in the air like a challenge. You wanted to know who I was this morning. Now you know. And you're going to remember it. As the door closed behind him, the stage was set for what was to come. Darren had spent years believing he was untouchable, but the cracks in his armor were finally beginning to show. And Marcus was just getting started. The door to Marcus's office shut softly behind him, the weight of the confrontation with Darren still heavy in the air. Laura was waiting for him in the corridor, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. As he approached, she fell into step beside him, her voice low but firm. He's not going to go down quietly. You saw it in his face, she said, glancing sideways at Marcus. That man is a cornered animal. He's going to fight this with everything he has. Marcus kept his gaze forward, his tone steady. Let him. Every excuse, every lie he tries to spin, it only strengthens the case against him. He doesn't realize that the very system he's relied on to protect him is starting to turn. Laura hesitated, then spoke again. The others, some of them are going to push back too. You're going after more than just Darren now. You're exposing cracks in the foundation. Marcus stopped and turned to face her, his expression unwavering. Laura, we didn't take these jobs to keep the foundation intact if it's rotten. We took them to fix what's broken, to make it better, no matter how many people try to stand in the way. She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. I'm with you. You know that. But Marcus, this fight won't just be about Darren. It's going to get messy. And you're not exactly making friends out there. I'm not here to make friends, he replied without hesitation. I'm here to make sure people like Darren don't get to keep hiding behind a badge. If that means ruffling some feathers, so be it. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Darren sat alone, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The folder Laura had placed in front of him remained untouched, its presence taunting him like a physical manifestation of his worst fears. His thoughts churned, oscillating between anger and panic. The smug confidence he had clung to earlier was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a gnawing realization that this time, he might not be able to talk his way out. The door opened again, and another officer entered. This one, Officer Brian McKinley, had worked alongside Darren for years. His presence was both familiar and unnerving, and Darren's eyes narrowed as Brian pulled up a chair and sat across from him. What the hell are you doing here? Darren snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. Brian leaned back slightly, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. I thought you could use a friend right about now. Darren scoffed, shaking his head. Friend? Right. You're here to spy for Hayes, aren't you? To see if I'll crack. Brian's expression hardened. I'm here because you're in over your head, Darren. And I don't think you even realize how deep. Darren leaned forward, his voice low and biting. You think I'm just going to roll over and let them destroy me? You think I'm scared of Hayes? You should be, Brian replied bluntly. Do you even know who he is? What he's done? The man's not playing games, Darren. He's built his career on integrity and accountability. He's not going to back down, not for you, not for anyone. Darren's jaw clenched, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. You think I care about his little crusade? He's just another suit trying to look good for the cameras. Brian shook his head, his frustration evident. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. Hayes isn't doing this for appearances. He's doing it because you crossed a line you can't come back from. And he's got everything he needs to make sure you're held accountable. Darren stared at him, his mind racing. For the first time, doubt began to creep into his expression. You think they'll just get rid of me? Like that? Brian's tone softened, but his words were no less damning. They don't need you, Darren. You've been a liability for years. The department's been covering for you because it was easier than dealing with the fallout. But now you've given them a reason to cut ties, and they're not going to waste it. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Darren's confidence, once so unshakable, was crumbling under the weight of Brian's words. But his pride, his stubborn refusal to admit defeat, kept him clinging to the edges of his crumbling facade. In the observation room, Marcus watched the exchange through the mirrored glass, his arms crossed over his chest. Laura stood beside him, her expression pensive as she observed Darren's slow unraveling. Do you think he'll crack? She asked quietly. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. It's not about whether he cracks. It's about whether he understands that this isn't just about him. It's about everyone he's hurt, everyone the system failed because it protected him instead. Laura nodded, her respect for Marcus evident in her expression. You're not just trying to hold him accountable. You're trying to send a message. Marcus finally looked at her, his voice firm but carrying the weight of conviction. Darren Collins isn't the first, and he won't be the last. But if we don't start somewhere, nothing changes. Back in the interrogation room, Darren's defiance finally gave way to something more vulnerable, fear. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze dropping to the folder in front of him. For the first time, he seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening. What happens now? He asked, his voice quieter, almost resigned. Brian's response was measured, but there was no sugarcoating the truth. Now. Now you face the consequences of your actions. You own up to what you've done, or you let them bury you. Either way, this ends here. As the weight of those words settled over Darren, the room seemed to close in around him. The fight was leaving him, replaced by the cold, hard reality that the system he had relied on for so long was no longer on his side. In that moment, Darren Collins wasn't just a man facing accountability. He was a symbol of a larger reckoning, one that Marcus Hayes had worked his entire career to bring about. And as the pieces of the story fell into place, the stage was set for the final chapter, a chapter that would leave no doubt about the power of justice and the cost of standing on the wrong side of it. The precinct felt heavier in the days following Darren's interrogation. The air was thick with unspoken words, the usual rhythm of chatter and banter replaced by a quiet tension. Officers moved through the halls with careful precision, as though afraid that any wrong step might bring the weight of justice crashing down on the next. Marcus Hayes's presence loomed large, not because he demanded it, but because of what he represented, a shift, a reckoning, and the unyielding pursuit of accountability. In his office, Marcus sat at his desk, the folder on Darren Collins now closed and set aside. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the fallout of exposing it was becoming more complicated by the hour. Laura Rivera was seated across from him, her face etched with concern as she went over the latest updates. "For more officers have come forward," she said, her voice low but steady. "All of them with stories about Darren. Misconduct, excessive force, even a few that border on outright criminal behavior. They've been sitting on this for years." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but calm. "And the rest? Are they staying quiet, or are they circling the wagons?" Laura sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's a mix. Some are starting to distance themselves, like they can feel the ship sinking. But others? They're doubling down. They see this as an attack, not just on Darren, but on the entire department. You're shaking the foundation, Marcus, and not everyone's ready for that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and clasping his hands together. "The foundation needs to be shaken. What we're uncovering isn't just about Darren, it's about a culture that's let people like him thrive. If some of them feel threatened, maybe they should take a hard look at why." Laura hesitated before responding, her voice softer now. "Do you ever wonder if it's too much? If pushing this hard, this fast, is going to do more harm than good?" Marcus looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "The harm's already been done, Laura. To the people Darren targeted, to the communities that lost trust in us because of men like him. If we don't act now, if we don't take this opportunity to set things right, we're just as complicit as the ones who stood by and did nothing." She nodded slowly, her respect for Marcus clear in her expression. "Then we keep going. But you know this isn't just about Darren anymore. The higher-ups are starting to pay attention. They're worried about how this looks, about what it says about the department as a whole." Marcus let out a quiet breath, his voice calm but resolute. "Good. They should be worried. This isn't about saving face or managing optics. It's about rebuilding trust, one step at a time." Outside the office, the precinct was a hive of subdued activity. Darren Collins sat at his desk, his presence a stark contrast to the tension that surrounded him. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a simmering resentment that he couldn't fully conceal. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with his colleagues, many of whom were now openly distancing themselves from him. One officer, a younger man named Eric, approached Darren cautiously, his voice low. "Hey, Collins. You okay?" Darren looked up, his expression hard. "What do you think?" "They've got me under a microscope. Hayes is gunning for me, and half this place is acting like I've got the plague." Eric shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, I don't know what's true and what's not, but maybe it's time to own up. If there's even a chance that some of this stuff sticks, you're better off getting ahead of it." Darren's jaw tightened, his voice sharp. "You think I'm just gonna roll over and let them take everything from me? I've worked too damn hard for this. Hayes thinks he's some kind of hero, but he doesn't know what it's like out there, dealing with the scum we have to deal with." Eric hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Maybe he does. And maybe that's why he's doing this. Because he knows we're supposed to be better than this." Darren didn't respond, but the weight of Eric's words lingered as the younger officer walked away. For the first time, doubt began to creep into Darren's thoughts, gnawing at the edges of his defiance. As the hours turned into days, the situation continued to escalate. The community began to catch wind of what was happening, the story spreading through whispers and speculation. Protests started to gather outside the precinct, small at first but growing steadily as more details emerged. Signs bearing messages like "Accountability Now" and "No Justice, No Trust" were held high, the voices of the protesters echoing through the streets. Inside, Marcus met with city officials and department heads, each meeting more tense than the last. The pressure to contain the fallout was mounting, but Marcus refused to back down. He stood firm in his resolve, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. During one particularly heated meeting, the mayor leaned forward, his tone sharp. Chief Hayes, I understand your commitment to justice, but this is spiraling out of control. The protests, the media attention, it's putting the entire city under a microscope. We need to manage this before it gets worse. Marcus's response was measured but firm. With all due respect, Mayor, managing this isn't the answer. Confronting it is. The protests, the attention, they're not the problem. They're a symptom of a deeper issue. And the only way to fix it is to address it head-on. The mayor's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his silence a reluctant acknowledgement of Marcus's point. Back at the precinct, Darren's world continued to shrink. His colleagues avoided him, his authority eroded by the mounting evidence against him. The weight of his actions, of the years of unchecked behavior, was finally catching up to him. And as the walls closed in, he found himself facing a choice he had never imagined he would have to make. Late one night, long after most of the precinct had emptied, Darren sat alone in the break room, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, fear, and regret. The door opened, and Marcus stepped inside, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He took a seat across from Darren, his expression calm but serious. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus broke the silence, his voice low but steady. You've got a choice to make, Darren. You can keep fighting this, keep trying to deny what you've done. Or you can take responsibility and start making things right. Darren looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and something else, something that might have been the first flicker of self-awareness. And what happens if I don't? Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Then the truth comes out anyway. But it won't just be about you. It'll be about everyone who enabled you, everyone who looked the other way. And the damage that does won't just fall on your shoulders. It'll fall on the entire department. The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time, Darren seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he stared at the table. The path ahead of him was clear, but whether he would take it remained uncertain. Marcus stood, his voice quiet but firm as he delivered his parting words. This is your chance, Darren. Don't waste it. As he walked away, the stage was set for the final act of a story that had already begun to reshape the fabric of the department and the city it served. The consequences of what came next would be felt by everyone involved, and the weight of those decisions hung heavy in the air, a reminder that justice, while often slow, was always inevitable. The precinct was shrouded in an uneasy quiet. The usual rhythm of the place, phones ringing, officers chatting, the shuffle of paperwork, was replaced with a tense, almost anticipatory silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next move, the next revelation, the next consequence. Darren Collins, once a loud and dominant presence, now seemed to shrink in his own shadow. He sat at his desk, flipping through paperwork he wasn't reading, his focus elsewhere. His mind raced, a torrent of thoughts, fears, and bitter resentment battling for dominance. Laura Rivera walked past him, her gaze flicking toward him briefly before she turned her attention to Marcus's office door. Inside, Marcus was leaning over his desk, reviewing yet another set of documents that painted a grim picture of Darren's legacy within the department. It wasn't just Darren anymore, it was what his behavior represented, the culture that allowed it, and the systems that had protected him. Every new file, every testimony that landed on Marcus's desk, added another layer to the picture. Laura knocked softly before stepping inside. Marcus glanced up, his expression calm but weary, and gestured for her to sit. She held a folder in her hand, one that she placed carefully on his desk before speaking. Another officer came forward. This one's big. Says Darren falsified a report to cover up excessive force on a minor 3 years ago. It's backed by video footage that was suppressed. Marcus's brow furrowed, his fingers brushing against the edge of the folder. How many more are going to come forward, he murmured, though the question seemed more to himself than to her. Laura leaned forward, her voice carrying a mix of determination and caution. Marcus, this is snowballing. Every time one person speaks up, it's giving others the courage to do the same. That's good, but it also means we're looking at something much bigger than Darren. If we don't handle this carefully, it could unravel the entire department. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the folder in front of him. That's the point, Laura. The department needs to unravel if it's this broken. But I understand what you're saying. We can't lose control of this. She hesitated, then said softly, the higher-ups are getting restless. They're not saying it outright, but you can feel it. They're worried this will spiral into something they can't contain. Marcus straightened, his voice steady. Good. Let them worry. They've spent too long ignoring the cracks in this system. If this makes them uncomfortable, it means we're doing something right. Meanwhile, Darren was sitting alone in the break room, his mind replaying Marcus's words from their conversation the night before. This is your chance, Darren. Don't waste it. The words echoed in his head, louder now as the walls around him seemed to close in. He thought about all the moments that had brought him to this point, the choices he'd made, the corners he'd cut, the people he'd hurt. He had always justified it to himself, always found a way to shift the blame. But now, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him, he found himself questioning everything. The door to the break room opened, and Brian McKinley stepped inside, his expression cautious. Darren looked up, his eyes narrowing. What do you want? He snapped, his voice defensive. Brian raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. Relax, Collins. I'm not here to lecture you. I just thought you might want to talk. Darren scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Talk about what? How everyone's turned on me. How Hayes is trying to ruin my life. Brian pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his tone calm but firm. You know that's not what this is about. Hayes isn't ruining your life, Darren. You did that yourself. Darren's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. You don't know what it's like. Being out there, dealing with people who hate you just because you wear a badge. It gets to you. Makes you hard. Brian's gaze didn't waver. I know exactly what it's like. I've been out there too, Darren. But I didn't let it turn me into, whatever this is. We took an oath to protect and serve. That doesn't mean taking out your frustrations on the people we're supposed to protect. Darren's defenses began to crumble, his voice quieter now. It's not that simple. You think I wanted to end up like this? It just happened. Brian leaned forward, his voice sharp but not unkind. It didn't just happen. You made choices, Darren. And now you're paying for them. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Darren didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the table. For the first time, he looked truly lost, as though the weight of his actions was finally sinking in. Brian watched him for a moment before standing, his parting words carrying a quiet finality. You still have a chance to do the right thing. Don't let your pride stop you. The precinct continued its quiet churn, each passing hour bringing new developments and new questions. Outside, the protests had grown larger, the voices of the community rising in a chorus of demands for justice. Inside, the pressure mounted, the cracks in the department's foundation widening with every revelation. In his office, Marcus sat across from the mayor once again, their conversation tense. The mayor's frustration was evident, his voice sharp as he spoke. You need to get a handle on this, Marcus. The media's eating it up, the protests are getting louder, and the department's credibility is on the line. Marcus met his gaze steadily. The department's credibility has been on the line for years. What we're doing now is the first step toward fixing it. If that means facing some uncomfortable truths, so be it. The mayor shook his head, exhaling sharply. You're risking a lot, Hayes. Your career, your reputation. If this goes sideways, you'll be the one they blame. Marcus's voice was calm but unyielding. If that's the cost of doing the right thing, I'll pay it. But I'm not going to back down just to make things easier for everyone else. The mayor stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly, his voice quieter now. Just make sure it's worth it. As the meeting ended, Marcus returned to his desk, his resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about Darren Collins. It was about justice, accountability, and the kind of change that could reshape the department and the city it served. And as the pieces continued to fall into place, the question loomed larger than ever. Would Darren finally take responsibility, or would he drag the entire department down with him? The answer was coming, and with it, the final reckoning that would leave no one untouched. The precinct was teetering on the edge of chaos, though outwardly everything remained as composed as ever. Officers moved about their duties, their conversations hushed, their movements cautious. It wasn't just the looming specter of Darren Collins's unraveling, it was the way Marcus Hayes had shifted the dynamics of the department. No one felt untouchable anymore. The unspoken rules that had governed their world for decades were beginning to crumble under the weight of accountability. Darren sat alone at his desk, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of him. He hadn't touched them in hours. His mind was somewhere else, far away from the precinct, far from the life he had carefully constructed over the years. Every conversation, every confrontation, every choice he had made to assert himself, to protect his ego, now felt like it was crashing down on him all at once. The worst part wasn't even the fear of losing his job. It was the realization that, deep down, he couldn't convince himself that he didn't deserve it. Laura Rivera stood in Marcus's office, her arms crossed as she leaned against the wall, watching him pore over the latest reports. Her expression was tight, a mixture of admiration and concern. Marcus's commitment to seeing this through was unwavering, but the toll it was taking on him was becoming harder to ignore. She finally broke the silence. "You're not sleeping," she said, her tone more observation than accusation. Marcus didn't look up, his pen scratching against the paper in front of him. "There's too much to do." Laura pushed off the wall, stepping closer to his desk. "Marcus, you can't carry all of this on your own. Darren, the department, the protests, it's too much for one person." He finally looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. "It's not about me, Laura. It's about making sure this department becomes what it should have been all along. I can rest when it's done." She sighed, taking a seat across from him. "And when will that be?" "Because from where I'm sitting, every step forward brings a new challenge. Darren isn't the only problem here. You know that." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. "I know. But he's the start. If we can hold him accountable, we set a precedent. We show this department, and this city, that no one is above the law." Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. Then let's make sure we get it right." In the break room, Darren was nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold when Brian walked in. The younger officer hesitated at the door before stepping inside, his movements careful, as though approaching a caged animal. Darren didn't look up, but he didn't need to. He could feel Brian's presence, the weight of his judgment. "Collins," Brian said, his voice neutral but firm. "We need to talk." Darren let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What's there to talk about? You all got what you wanted. Hayes has me backed into a corner, and now you're just waiting for me to fold." Brian pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his expression steady. "This isn't about what we want. It's about what's right. And whether you like it or not, you're the only one who can decide how this ends." Darren finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "How it ends? It ends with me losing everything I worked for, everything I bled for. You think that's fair?" Brian didn't flinch. "I think fairness left the table a long time ago. This isn't about fair, Darren. It's about justice. And you don't get to hide behind excuses anymore. You need to own this. Darren's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. You think I'm the only one? You think I'm the only person in this department who's crossed a line? Why me, huh? Why am I the one taking the fall? Brian's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Because you're the one who got caught. And maybe you're right, maybe you're not the only one. But someone has to be first. Someone has to be the example. Darren's laugh was bitter, almost cruel. An example. That's all I am to you people. A scapegoat to make Hayes look good. Brian leaned forward, his voice dropping. No one's asking you to be a scapegoat. We're asking you to be accountable. There's a difference, and you know it. Darren didn't respond, his gaze dropping back to his coffee. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the conversation pressing down on both of them. Elsewhere in the precinct, Marcus was meeting with the city's legal team, their conversation tense and loaded with implications. The lawyers were cautious, their words carefully chosen as they laid out the potential fallout of pursuing charges against Darren. This is going to open a can of worms, one of them said, their tone sharp. If we prosecute Collins, it sets a precedent. Other officers might come under scrutiny, and that could lead to a full-blown investigation into the department. Marcus didn't flinch. That's the point. This department needs to be investigated. We need to root out the corruption, the misconduct, the culture that's allowed people like Collins to thrive. If that means facing some hard truths, so be it. The lawyer sighed, exchanging a glance with their colleague. You know this could cost you your career, right? If this blows up, you'll be the one they blame. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. If that's the price of justice, I'll pay it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The legal team nodded reluctantly, their expressions a mixture of respect and resignation. They knew Marcus wouldn't back down, and in that moment, they realized just how far he was willing to go to see this through. Back in the break room, Darren was still sitting with Brian, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Darren broke the silence, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. What happens if I come clean? He asked, his gaze fixed on the table. Brian's tone was steady, almost gentle. You take responsibility for what you've done. You face the consequences. But you also get a chance to start over, to rebuild. It won't be easy, but it'll be honest. Darren let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. But beneath the defeat, there was something else, a flicker of something that might have been resolve. As the day wore on, the pieces continued to fall into place. The protests outside the precinct grew louder, the voices of the community demanding justice and accountability. Inside, the tension reached a boiling point, every officer feeling the weight of the moment. And at the center of it all, Marcus Hayes remained steadfast, his commitment to justice unshaken. The final decision was looming, the moment that would determine the course of not just Darren's future, but the future of the entire department. The question wasn't just whether Darren would take responsibility, it was whether the department itself would rise to the occasion and become the institution it was always meant to be. And as the precinct braced for what came next, one thing was clear, there was no turning back. The precinct was buzzing as the sun dipped below the horizon, the evening casting long shadows across the city. Outside, the protests had swelled to their largest yet, a sea of voices demanding justice and accountability. Inside, the weight of the moment pressed on every corner of the department. It was clear to everyone that things would never return to the way they were, and for Marcus Hayes, that was precisely the point. In the main conference room, Marcus stood at the head of the table, facing a panel of city officials, legal representatives, and department heads. Darren Collins was seated off to the side, flanked by his attorney, his expression unreadable. The evidence against him had been presented, the testimonies laid bare, and now, the final decision loomed. Marcus's voice was calm but resolute as he addressed the room, his words carrying the weight of the past weeks. "This isn't just about Darren Collins," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about a culture that allowed misconduct to thrive unchecked. It's about a department that failed the people it swore to protect. Darren's actions are inexcusable, but they're not isolated. If we don't address the root of this problem, we're condemning ourselves to repeat it." The room was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. Darren's attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of how damning the case had become. Finally, Darren himself spoke, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "I messed up," he said, his gaze fixed on the table. "I let the badge go to my head. I hurt people, and I can't take that back. But I'm willing to face the consequences. Whatever they are." The admission hung in the air, surprising everyone, including Marcus. It wasn't redemption, but it was a step toward accountability, a crack in the wall Darren had spent years building around himself. Marcus nodded slightly, his expression softening, but his resolve remained firm. "Taking responsibility is the first step," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But it doesn't end there. The system that allowed this to happen needs to change. And that starts today." The decision was swift. Darren was officially removed from the department, stripped of his badge, and handed over to the legal system to face the charges against him. The weight of the consequences was immense, but for the first time in years, Darren didn't try to fight it. He left the room with his attorney, his shoulders slumped but his step steady, as though he were finally facing the reality he had avoided for so long. In the days that followed, the department began to transform. Marcus spearheaded a series of reforms aimed at increasing accountability and transparency, implementing new training programs, and establishing stronger channels for officers and community members to report misconduct. The protests outside the precinct gradually subsided as the community began to see the changes taking shape. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but it was a start, a foundation on which to build something better. Laura Rivera was promoted to a leadership role, her dedication and integrity recognized by Marcus and the rest of the department. She became a driving force behind the reforms, her voice a constant reminder of why the changes mattered. Her partnership with Marcus grew stronger, their shared vision for the department uniting them in their efforts to create lasting change. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. The weight of what had been uncovered, of the lives impacted by the failures of the department, stayed with him. But as he walked through the precinct one evening, the sounds of officers working together, the tension replaced by a cautious optimism, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Weeks later, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium, addressing a room filled with officers, community leaders, and city officials. His voice was steady as he spoke about the importance of accountability, of rebuilding trust, of the work still to be done. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus didn't linger in the moment. This wasn't about recognition, it was about responsibility. As for Darren, his life took a different turn. Stripped of his badge and facing the consequences of his actions, he began a slow, painful journey toward redemption. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but he started to confront the choices he had made, seeking counseling and volunteering with organizations dedicated to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. It was a far cry from the life he had known, but it was a step toward being a better man. In the end, the story of Darren Collins wasn't one of complete redemption, but one of accountability and the possibility of change. The story of Marcus Hayes, however, was one of leadership, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. His efforts didn't just change the department, they inspired a city to believe in the possibility of justice. This story reminds us of the importance of accountability, not just for those in power, but for all of us. It shows us that change is possible, but it requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. What would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have had the strength to stand up against a system that seemed unchangeable? Or in Darren's shoes, could you have admitted your mistakes and faced the consequences? Let us know in the comments below. we'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the importance of justice and the power of doing what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist. We're here to bring you stories that challenge, inspire, and remind you of the complexities of the world we live in. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next twist.